Welcome. We're now on Chapter 2, Cross-Cultural Research Methods. This chapter will be focused on three main objectives. The first one is to describe the different types of cross-cultural comparative studies and how they are different. The second objective is to define 8 types of bias that are uniquely associated with cross-cultural studies. And finally, our third objective is to define Indigenous studies. These are the types of cross-cultural studies we'll be discussing in the upcoming slides. Let's start with exploratory versus hypothesis testing studies. Exploratory studies examine the existence of cross-cultural similarities or differences. So for example, I run a newcomers group in Paterson, New Jersey, with Bangladeshi, Middle Eastern, and Spanish-speaking students. We have done comparisons of their acculturative stress levels, as well as some of their indicators of mental health symptoms. All I'm doing is seeing if there are differences across groups. However, I am not making any inferences about why the differences exist. I'm just trying to have a broad scope as to whether there are similarities and differences across these three newly immigrated groups. The weakness of this type of study is that it gives me very limited capability, giving them some self-report measures about their levels of acculturative stress and mental health symptoms doesn't help me solve the causes of these differences. This is sort of a first step. The next step is probably a hypothesis testing study where you examine why cultural differences exist. You have to be careful because some of these inferences can promote cross-cultural biases and inequivalence. So you have to be very careful as to how you form some of your hypotheses. Structure-oriented studies versus level-oriented studies. Structure-oriented studies help you measure or compare a culture's constructs, structures, or relationships among constructs with those of another culture. So we can use the example of intelligence. In Western cultures, we might believe intelligence is associated with analytical thinking, whereas Easterners may think that it has something to do more with a holistic type of reasoning. Therefore, intelligence may be measured differently, and we're comparing the constructs themselves and what they mean. A level-oriented study is different in the sense that you are now kind of comparing the mean levels of the scores across cultures. So perhaps a level-oriented study might be something like measuring levels of individualism or collectivism across different cultures, and based on that measure, looking at their mean scores to say whether a culture is more individualistic or more collectivistic based on this measure. Cross-cultural comparative studies also include individual level versus ecological level studies. So an individual level study is where individual participants provide data and these individuals, the person themselves, is the unit of analysis. So we're looking at their individual scores on, let's say, a personality construct. Ecological studies are using countries or cultures as the unit of analysis. And then you could have multi-level studies where you're doing a little bit of both at different stages of your study. But those are the two main levels in which you would be conducting studies in cross-cultural research. So here's the problem. Sometimes we need to just get that correct research question. What's the right research question? Research design starts with a comprehensive knowledge of literature. You can't start any research until you learn a great deal about the subject matter you're wishing to study. So understanding the need for a study to be conducted leads to questions about how to conduct it. You'll know where are the holes in the literature? What are the things that we haven't answered? What are the current controversies? So you must always do a thorough literature review before you conduct any study. And there are many challenges faced by researchers. One, isolating the source of cultural differences, figuring out exactly what might be the cause of these cultural differences, um, and making sure, do we even know if it's cultural or non-cultural? So it's very, very hard. And we have to know if there is validity in our theoretical models. Researchers must adopt design strategies that match their beliefs and models. So you want to make sure your model isn't completely off. Hypothesis testing studies have two main types, unpacking studies and experiments. Hypothesis testing studies are those that measure an aspect of culture that is theoretically hypothesized to produce cultural differences. So a hypothesis testing study is just that. You're testing a hypothesis that you have. You're trying to empirically link that measured aspect of culture with the dependent variable of interest. And the two main ways of doing this are either unpacking or experiments. Unpacking studies are those in which you have cross-cultural comparisons that include the measurement of a context variable that assesses a cultural factor considered to produce the differences on the target variable being compared across culture. So I'm going to use the example that someone else used, I'm stealing, of an 18th century Civil War situation scenario where they were seeing that um, there was much more violence in the South versus the North in regards to argument related violence. So in the South, it was more likely to get to significant aggression or even murder. And there were a lot of theories as to why this might be happening. Is it because there was more slavery in the South? Is it because it's hotter in the South than the North? Is it because the people in the South were poorer? Um, and then there was this other theory where they were comparing herder communities, remember this is the 18th century, versus farmer communities. So in order to unpack what might be the reasons, they started to kind of look at all these different theories to try to understand which variable is more likely to be a viable one to study. So they looked and, they found that actually, slaves are more common in farming versus herding areas. They noted that we saw more violence in the in the urban areas versus the rural areas. And these two areas had similar temperatures. So therefore, is it really temperature? So that was sort of discarded. Um, they found, if we're looking at poverty, they noted that, yes, farmers made more than herders, but not much more. The folks in the North weren't making that much more than the folks in the South. So therefore, there wasn't much of a difference there. When they kept unpacking, they were able to see something about a culture of honor that existed among the herding cultures and communities in our pre-Civil War, Southern communities here in the United States. So I know that's a long-winded example, but in order to unpack, you have to kind of investigate and understand what are all the different variables, context variables that might be making a difference. In experiments, you're doing more of a cause and effect. So, in one college study, they looked, at all white male college students, and they looked at the ones who grew up in the North versus the South. And they insulted them on purpose. They used a fake person to insult them. And then they assessed the cortisol and testosterone levels of these individual students. And what they found were that the Northerners had very little effect or change in their cortisol or testosterone levels at all when they were insulted. It was almost as if they didn't care. Whereas those in the South that were raised in the South grew very angry and they had, very marked changes in their cortisol and testosterone levels. So that was an experimental design to see if there were going to be some physiological changes. And then priming studies are a little bit different in the sense that you're trying to give a little hint or prime something, you're trying to actually bias a little bit or manipulate your participants in your study so you can see if that manipulation makes any change. I know Wheeler, Jarvis, and Petty back in 2001 primed racial stereotypes purposely by asking folks to tell a story from Eric's perspective or from Tyrone's perspective to see if there was any differences in the stories that were produced. So priming studies, um, are also hypothesis testing studies. They are experiments, but it's a specific way that you would experimentally manipulate. So it kind of falls under experiments. One very important thing that we must always be mindful of is bias. And if we want to make a study in which we're comparing two different cultures, we have to make sure that there's an equivalence to what we're studying. Does intelligence mean the same thing? Does a certain word mean the same thing? So we're going to go into all the different types of bias and equivalence issues that can come up in a study. If bias exists in a cross-cultural comparative study, the comparison loses all its meaning. It means nothing. Biases are those differences that do not have the same meaning within and across cultures. And then equivalence is whether the state or condition of similarity in conceptual meaning and empirical method between cultures is the same. So let's take a look and break that down a bit. There are 8 types of bias. They're all listed there, and I'm going to go one by one, but these are your 8. First off, construct bias. This is when there is cross-cultural differences in the definitions or meanings of psychological concepts. So if I am measuring depression across cultures and the way that I'm measuring it means depression means something very different, then that construct doesn't hold true and those comparisons are less meaningful. So if in a Western culture, we're thinking about clinical depression, whereas somewhere else they might be thinking depression means something else, then that is a construct bias. A linguistic bias is when the words being used, especially when you have translation, are not meaning the same thing. So we all know that sometimes when you translate a word, it doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same thing in the other language. So there is a lot that has to be done to kind of mitigate this type of bias. So whenever there are translations of a measure, you should use back translations and committees to make sure that the language used is appropriate. So for example, when we translated a measure into Spanish, we had someone else back translated into English, and we went to see if it meant the same thing when it was back translated. We wanted to have people from different Spanish speaking countries look at the sentence and see if it still had the same meaning. And we wanted to make sure that a monolingual person could read it and understand it, not someone who is bilingual English speaking and already has a little bit of that interference. Measurement bias is the degree to which the measures used to collect the data in different cultures are equally valid and equally reliable. Valid means it's measuring what it's supposed to, and reliable is that it's consistent. So different cultures conceptually define a construct differently or measure it differently. So when you're using this measure, that measure might not actually be psychometrically equivalent. So there may be something wrong where that same factor doesn't mean the same thing, and you have to analyze this statistically. So you do want to norm and try out measures before you use them to make cross-cultural comparisons. There's also response biases. So I know sometimes when I give measures to my clients, some of them respond what they think I want them to respond. Some just yes everything because they want to be very acquiescent. Some have very extreme responses, like they're always sad, they're always anxious, they're always, even though there's a gradient or a Likert scale. So we have to be very careful to know that there are biases in the way people respond to questions. And if there's also kind of the extreme response bias that's found in cultures that encourage masculinity, power, and status. So we have to be very, very careful to consider how these biases may impact the results of cross-cultural comparisons. There's also the theoretical model bias or model bias. And this is a condition in which the theoretical framework that you use for your study is problematic. Okay, so if frameworks and hypotheses tested are not equivalent across cultures, then the data obtained may not be comparable. So you want to make sure that when you develop your theoretical model, that the underlying, you're studying the hypotheses that are being tested in the different cultures and understanding why they might be different across cultures. You might want to make sure that you test each framework and hypothesis within a culture before you start doing cross-cultural comparisons. A sampling bias is when there's something wrong with your sample, right? So the samples may not be great representations that are generalizable as a whole. Like maybe you have too much of a specific demographic within that culture that biases or skews your data. So you want to make sure that the folks that you're testing do have as much generalizability for the culture that you're testing. So for example, if I want to see if Latinos differ in a specific area and I'm only assessing second generation young college female students, that's really not giving me a good sense of the Latino culture in general, right? How people in that group would respond, where there's so many people not included in that. So you have to be very careful. Sometimes we're sampling out of convenience, but we need to make sure that our sample is representative of the groups we're intending to measure. Procedural or administration bias refers to situations in which your process of conducting the research is different in the different cultures. So we ran into that problem when we were comparing the Bangladeshi students with the Latino students, because for the Latino students, they were pulling them out of the classroom and putting them in a different space. And the Bangladeshi students we were seeing them in their own classroom with their teacher in the room. And the whole process of getting the referrals was also different. So that just kind of messed up. There was too much of a procedural bias in that version of the original study. So if the procedures by which the data are collected don't really mean the same, things are done a little bit differently, then they could be the cause of the differences. And then interpretational bias is when researchers interpret the data with their own globalized bias in a very stereotypical, culturally filtered way. We all have our cultural filters. And because of that, we may have blind spots. And interpretational bias is, when those blind spots get in the way of how we interpret our data. So sometimes we have this cultural attribution fallacy that, that the culture had a role in producing the differences, and there might be some other reason. So we need to kind of be very careful with that. Method validation studies. So I just want to, before we move on, we sometimes want to make sure that we are validating the methods in which we're doing our studies. And two very, very important concepts are validity and reliability. Validity is the degree to which a finding, a measurement, or a statistic is accurate or represents what it's supposed to, right? So if the questions that are set up to measure depression aren't actually measuring depression, they're measuring some, let's say anxiety, for example, then it isn't really a valid measure. Reliability is something that we want to make sure that the measure would be consistent. So you would be able to test and retest if, different raters are are observing some aspect of the experiment, that there's some inter-rater reliability, that they score things similarly. So they have to kind of have some time where they calibrate with each other and they figure out that how they're going to do this measurement in a way that's consistent across the board. Because if you're going to be comparing, you have to make sure it's consistent. So validity and reliability are very important. So we've talked a bit about these cross-cultural validation studies. These are studies that examine whether a scale, a test, or a measure originally developed in a culture is valid in another culture. These first steps are extremely important before you do any cross-cultural research. The purpose of these studies is to establish the equivalence of the scale, test, or measure across cultures. So please understand that we do have to do quite a bit of method validation before we go into doing any cross-cultural research, or our biases could really get in the way. And then Indigenous cultural studies is something we really haven't talked about, but sometimes we just need to study a particular culture in greater depth. Anthropologists are great at Indigenous cultural studies. These are rich descriptions of complex theoretical models within a single culture. And the insights generated from these studies maybe, will be later compared across studies and across cultures, but first you have to really understand. So when I say the word Indigenous, this doesn't mean just Indigenous populations. No, this means a population, well, a population that is native to that place. So you would be studying folks in the native environment and getting the rich information about that. So there is an example of some Indigenous studies where they looked at some populations in New Guinea and the Dominican Republic, where children were raised as a female and identified as a female, and then at puberty, they start obtaining male genitalia in these specific small communities. And these are very kind of unusual occurrences that had to be studied in a more rich detail within that context, because there wasn't a way to study it otherwise. Indigenous cultural studies really give us a sense of what is going on in this native environment. And that's all I have for this week. So stay tuned.